Victoria had been married to James for 7 years, and somewhere between the mortgage payments and the monotony of suburban routines, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be desired. Her husband still loved her, she was certain of that, but love had calcified into comfortable indifference. They passed each other in hallways with quick pecks on the cheek. Sex had become an obligation marked on an invisible calendar, scheduled and perfunctory. When Daniel arrived at the architectural firm 3 months ago, everything shifted. He was everything James wasn't: spontaneous, attentive, dangerously charming. He noticed when Victoria changed her hair. He remembered that she liked her coffee with an extra shot of espresso. He looked at her the way James used to, back when they were young and reckless. It started innocently enough: late meetings that ran past sunset, conversations that drifted from professional into personal. Daniel would lean against her desk, and Victoria would feel her heart accelerate in a way it hadn't in years. The first time their hands touched, reaching for the same document, she didn't pull away. The electricity between them was undeniable, intoxicating. That Tuesday evening, Victoria texted James, "I'll be working late tonight. Don't wait up." She'd sent similar messages 100 times, but this one felt different. This one was a lie wrapped in routine. James responded with his usual reply, "Okay. Love you." The guilt hit her immediately, followed by something darker: anticipation. The office had emptied by 7 o'clock. Most of the team had scattered to dinner plans or home to families. Victoria pretended to work, reorganizing files she'd already organized, checking emails she'd already read. When Daniel finally emerged from the conference room, loosening his tie, her mouth went dry. "Everyone's gone," he said, moving toward her desk with deliberate slowness. Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she looked up at him. She knew what was about to happen. More importantly, she knew she wanted it to happen. "I know," she whispered. Daniel closed the distance between them, his hand finding her cheek. The kiss was inevitable, like gravity. It tasted like danger and promise and everything her marriage had stopped offering. When his lips found her neck, Victoria closed her eyes and let herself disappear into the moment. The rational part of her mind, the part that screamed about consequences, was silenced by 7 years of neglect. They moved to his office, and Victoria stopped thinking about James entirely. She stopped thinking about the vows, the shared history, the comfortable life they'd built together. She thought only of the way Daniel made her feel alive again. For the first time in years, she felt like someone worth paying attention to. After, they lay on his office couch, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing circles on her bare shoulder. The city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like scattered diamonds. "You're beautiful," Daniel whispered. Victoria knew she should feel ashamed. Instead, she felt reborn. James had never been the impulsive type, but something made him decide to surprise Victoria that evening. Perhaps it was the distance he'd been feeling between them lately, a subtle erosion he couldn't quite name. Maybe subconsciously, he sensed something was wrong. He thought a romantic gesture, champagne, her favorite restaurant takeout, might bridge the gap that had been widening for months. He parked in the nearly empty garage at her office building just after 8 p.m. The lobby was quiet, just a security guard who barely glanced up as James passed. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt eternal. When he reached her floor, something made him hesitate. The hallway was dimly lit, most offices dark except for a few scattered lights. He walked toward Victoria's desk but stopped short when he saw Daniel's office light glowing like a beacon. The door was slightly ajar. James heard it before he saw anything: a soft laugh, Victoria's laugh, followed by a man's voice saying something he couldn't quite make out. His heart began to race. He pushed the door open further. What he saw would be forever burned into his memory: Victoria sitting on the edge of Daniel's desk, her blouse half-buttoned, her hair disheveled. Daniel stood in front of her, his hand on her knee, looking at her with an intensity that James recognized as pure desire. Her legs were tangled with his, and when she turned and saw James, her expression shifted from passion to pure terror. "James," she breathed, suddenly scrambling to pull her blouse closed. The champagne bottle slipped from James's fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet office. Expensive French wine pooled across the carpet like blood. Daniel stepped back immediately, suddenly aware of the intruder. He reached for his shirt, but it was already too late. The image was already seared into James's mind. His wife, disheveled and glowing with another man's touch. "It's not what it looks like," Victoria started, but they both knew that was a lie. It was exactly what it looked like. James couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He felt like he was watching this scene from outside his body, as if this couldn't possibly be happening to him. 7 years of marriage, thousands of nights sleeping beside her, plans they'd made for their future, all of it felt suddenly fragile, hollow. "How long?" James finally managed, his voice barely recognizable. Victoria stood up, pulling her clothes together with shaking hands. "James, please, let me explain." "How long?" 3 months, she whispered. 3 months. A quarter of a year. 90 days of lies and deception. 90 days of her saying, "I love you," before she left for work. 90 days of returning home reeking of another man's cologne, and him not noticing because he was too wrapped up in his own world to truly see his wife anymore. The realization nearly broke him. James left the office without another word. He couldn't trust himself to speak, couldn't trust his body not to do something violent. He drove around the city for hours, the champagne bottle still sitting accusingly on his passenger seat, slowly warping in the summer heat. By midnight, he found himself at his best friend's house. Michael took one look at his face and knew something catastrophic had happened. James didn't cry when he told him, he couldn't seem to access that emotion. Instead, he described the scene with clinical precision, as if narrating something that had happened to someone else. "You need to go home," Michael finally said. "You need to have a real conversation with her." But James wasn't ready. Instead, he checked into a hotel, a nondescript place near the airport where no one knew his name. He lay awake, watching the ceiling fan rotate, wondering when his wife had stopped being the woman he'd married. He wondered if he'd ever really known her at all. Victoria, meanwhile, was falling apart. She'd tried calling James repeatedly that night. After the 10th unanswered call, she realized he was done with her, or at least done responding to her. Daniel had tried to apologize, tried to minimize what had happened, tried to suggest they could figure this out together. She'd left him standing in his office looking confused. At home, Victoria sat on the edge of the couch in the dark, still wearing her partially buttoned blouse. The familiar surroundings of her marriage now felt like a haunted house. Every photograph on the mantel, their honeymoon in Greece, their first home, James laughing at some joke she'd made, suddenly looked like evidence of a life built on quicksand. The shame she hadn't felt with Daniel came crashing down now in waves. She thought of James's face, that expression of shock and betrayal. She thought of how long it would take to break someone like that. Worse, she knew that was exactly what she'd done. By Friday, James had returned home to retrieve some clothes. Victoria was waiting for him, her eyes red and swollen from days of crying. She looked diminished somehow, smaller. "I want to try," she said desperately. Daniel meant nothing. It was just about how he made me feel, and I was lonely, and..." "You weren't lonely," James said quietly. "You were bored with me. There's a difference. That's not fair. Isn't it?" He moved past her to the bedroom. "I was the one who was lonely, Victoria. I was the one who kept trying to connect with you. You just kept slipping further away." She followed him, her voice breaking. "So this is my fault? You're blaming me for your neglect?" "I'm not blaming you for anything. I'm just seeing clearly for the first time in years. He pulled a suitcase from the closet and began methodically filling it with clothes. I wanted to surprise you that night with dinner. I was trying, Victoria. Even when things were difficult, I was still trying. James, please. I can't do this right now. I can't even look at you without seeing him. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. It was civil, which somehow made it worse. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no shouting matches. Just lawyers and paperwork and the systematic dismantling of a shared life. Victoria moved into a small apartment across town. She quit the architecture firm and found a new job at a different company. She never saw Daniel again, though she'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd also moved on, transferring to the firm's Los Angeles office. He'd left a note on her desk after she quit, "I'm sorry for what happened. I hope you find your way back to happiness." The cruelty of that apology, as if he'd been a catalyst rather than a willing participant, made her angry in a way she hadn't been before. James threw himself into work, expanding his consulting firm and building the kind of success that felt hollow without someone to share it with. He began therapy, working through his own failures in the marriage. His therapist helped him see that while Victoria's infidelity was unforgivable, his emotional absence had created the conditions for it. Understanding that didn't excuse her behavior, but it did help him accept his own culpability. A year after the divorce, Victoria ran into one of her friends from James's circle at a grocery store. The friend was cautious at first, unsure which side of the divorce she was supposed to be on. Victoria laughed bitterly at the awkwardness. "It's okay," Victoria said. "I know I'm the villain in this story." "No," the friend said carefully. "You're just a complicated person who made a terrible choice. James is also just trying to figure out how to be happy again." Victoria cried in her car for an hour after that interaction. She'd expected anger, judgment, rejection. She hadn't expected compassion. She realized that everyone, James, her friends, even Daniel, had already forgiven her because they'd moved on with their lives. Only she was still punishing herself. She started journaling, reading self-help books, going to therapy herself. Slowly, she began to understand the parts of her that were broken, the need for validation, the fear of abandonment, the way she'd confused passion with love. She'd sought in Daniel what she'd felt responsible for nurturing in her marriage to James. Both approaches had been fundamentally selfish. James had begun dating again, tentatively at first. His new girlfriend was kind and present in a way Victoria never had been. Seeing them together at mutual friends' events was excruciating for Victoria, not because she still loved James, but because she could see what she'd thrown away. Not James himself, necessarily, but the possibility of a life built on honesty and mutual respect. 2 years after the divorce, James received an email from Victoria. He almost deleted it without reading, but something made him open it. The letter was long, carefully composed, and clearly the product of significant emotional labor. Victoria apologized not with excuses but with specific acknowledgement of what she'd done. She owned her choices completely. She didn't ask for his forgiveness. Instead, she offered her own understanding of how her actions had wounded him. "I spent a long time trying to understand why I did what I did," she wrote. "Not to excuse it, but to make sure I never hurt someone that way again. The truth is, I was deeply unhappy, but instead of addressing that, I looked for someone who would make me feel different." Daniel was exciting precisely because he wasn't James. He wasn't the person I'd built a life with. He was a fantasy, exciting and consequence-free in my mind until reality collided with my choices. She continued, "I've realized that I married you because I loved you, but I betrayed you for the same reasons I married you, because I was seeking external validation for my own worth. I needed you to prove I was valuable. When the newness wore off and you became comfortable with me, I panicked. I thought your comfort meant you'd stopped loving me, when really it just meant we'd moved past the intoxication phase into something that could have been deeper. I was too immature to understand that. The letter concluded, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not even asking you to respond. I just wanted you to know that I see what I did. I see how thoroughly I destroyed something good. And I'm genuinely sorry." James read the letter 3 times. By the third reading, he found himself crying, not for what he'd lost, but for the complexity of human relationships and how easily they could shatter. He didn't respond for 2 weeks. When he finally did, it was brief: "Thank you for this. I won't say I forgive you, because forgiveness implies absolving you of responsibility. But I do accept that we were both lost in that marriage, just in different ways. I hope you find peace." Victoria received his response on a Tuesday. She read it once and then closed her email. She didn't feel happy or relieved. She felt hollow, as if the apology she'd needed to make had been more for her own healing than for his. She realized that James had moved on completely, not just emotionally, but existentially. She was no longer even a significant enough presence in his life to be angry at. That understanding was its own kind of punishment. Years later, Victoria would describe that period of her life as her greatest failure and her most important teacher. She never cheated again, though she also never married again. Instead, she built a life of deliberate solitude, learning to be comfortable with her own company before ever inviting another person to share it. James eventually proposed to his girlfriend. At their wedding, he barely thought of Victoria. She was a chapter that had closed, important not for how it ended but for what it had taught him about himself. And somewhere in the city, in a quiet moment alone, Victoria allowed herself one last memory of that night in Daniel's office, not with longing or regret, but with the clear-eyed recognition that it had been the moment her old life ended and her real life began. The life where she finally learned to be honest with herself about who she was, what she needed, and how to build something real instead of chasing the mirage of someone else's desire. The late-night surprise had revealed everything. It just took years to understand exactly what it had revealed.